Good morning and welcome to the Collaborative on Health and the Environment Alaska teleconference on assessing the public health impacts of coal transportation and export with guest presenters Dr. Frank James and Denny Larson. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE-Alaksa is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and CHE-Alaksa aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the websites www.akaction.org and www.healthandenvironment.org. The call will last 1 hour. Except for the speakers, all participants are muted during the presentation, and slides of Dr. James's presentation and other materials that will be referenced can be found by clicking on the title of today's call on our homepage at www.akaction.org. Before introducing our first speaker, I'd like to give a little background on why we are having this call today. Alaskans are increasingly concerned about the public health threat posed by coal mining and transportation in light of increasing exports from Usabeli's mines near Healy and proposed new coal mines at Wishbone Hill and Chuitna in Alaska. Expansion of coal mining in Alaska means more coal transported by train and truck and stockpiled in Seward, as well as at the new Port McKenzie facility, just a few miles upwind of Anchorage. People in all of these areas may be inhaling toxic coal dust and diesel fumes, and they have a right to know what they may be exposed to. Our first guest, Dr. Frank James, will be talking about some of the health effects that have been linked to pollution from coal transportation and export facilities, and why 190 concerned physicians in Whatcom County, Washington, are calling for comprehensive health impact assessment of the proposed Gateway Pacific coal terminal at Cherry Point, north of Bellingham. Our second speaker is Denny Larson, Executive Director of Global Community Monitor. He will be discussing what led citizen volunteers in Seward, Alaska, which is where Alaska coal is stockpiled and then loaded onto ships bound for Asia, to call on his organization to help them start a year-long air quality monitoring project last month. The goal of the monitoring project is to measure how much of the dust blowing around town is coal dust and to analyze its potential toxicity. Now I am pleased to welcome and introduce our first guest, Dr. Frank James. Dr. James is active in teaching, research, and medical practice. His interests focus on health promotion and disease prevention. He is currently the health officer for San Juan County and health officer for the Nooksuk Indian Nation. Dr. James has been a clinical assistant professor at the University of Washington School of Public Health since 1992. He also works on the organizing committee for Whatcom Docs, a group of nearly 200 physicians that are working to bring a scientific evaluation of the health impacts of the proposed coal port and coal trains on their community. For a decade, Dr. James was a primary investigator for an NIH-funded prostate cancer prevention trial at the St. Joseph Hospital Cancer Center. He was also the medical director of Interfaith Family Health Center for 10 years, a local community clinic that provides care on a sliding fee scale and continues to see over 50,000 visits a year. Welcome, Frank. Would you like to go ahead and begin?
Sure, thank you very much. I don't know how many people have access to the slides, but there are a set of slides on the website. The first one of which really illustrates one of the key issues about our concerns in our community. It's a picture of a beautiful seaside community, the Fairhaven part of Bellingham, and a small thin line along the water. If you look at that picture, is about a mile-long coal train going through our community. An otherwise very beautiful picture. The things that got the doctors together, a few of them had concerns about it. I think were pretty vague initially. And there was a small group of us that came together and began to look at the scientific literature just about what impacts this might have on our community. And as we reviewed the first dozen or so articles, there were a number of us that actually became more concerned. We began to look first at the issue of coal dust, and then we moved to a variety of other issues that came to the fore. So far, we've evaluated over 400 scientific articles published in referee journals. That is, that they aren't really published, just they've been critically evaluated by a variety of people. These articles all point just in one direction. They all indicate there may be substantial health impacts from the coal train, coal terminal that is proposed to be in our community. As we move through those 400 articles, article after article suggested there would be significant impacts. And this raised the awareness and the concern of other positions in the community. And pretty soon 140 doctors had joined us, then 160, then 180, and now we're almost 190 physicians that signed to our basic statement. It's a very simple statement. It's only 2 pages long. It's available on the website, coaltrainfacts.org. It has 4 main conclusions and an annotated bibliography that goes with it. We decided not only should we look at literature, but that anybody that's concerned about it should look at the primary literature about it. So we wrote an annotation, a brief summary of each of those articles that were the primary core of the issues, and make those available to anybody that wants to view them, either the people that might be for or against the coal port. We then began to look at, well, what can we do about this? We reviewed the environmental impact statement process and concluded that it was extremely weak in identifying both the problems and the potential solutions to health impacts. There's another process called the health impact assessment, which has been is a fairly new process, but I think is much, much more robust in identifying what the potential problems might be and who those problems might impact in the community. On the second slide, if you have those available, you can see that really the core issue is that in our community, which now has about 3 coal trains a day going through it up to Canada, these trains are now about 1 mile long, but under this proposal, they would become 1.6 miles long. And one of the first things we learned was that for those trains to even stop, if they lock up all the brakes, it takes 1 mile for them to stop, even with all the brakes engaged. So these are very large trains. The other thing we discovered, and somebody noticed this just looking at the tracks, was that there isn't 1 engine on these trains. These trains are so heavy they require 4 engines to pull them. The ancillary thing we discovered about that is that not only does it take the 4 trains to pull them, but that this potentially creates a whole secondary we hadn't initially been concerned about diesel particulate matter. That is the stuff that comes out of those engines. The next thing we discovered is that there would be more than 400 extremely large ships traversing our waterways. Now, we're used to ships hauling crude oil from Alaska to our waters. There's several refineries in our region. These ships are all double-hulled and have extremely tight regulations on how they come through our waterways to prevent large oil spills. However, the ships that would be coming to take this coal away are single-hull vessels, many of whom have several million gallons of fuel inside. And this is pretty toxic fuel. This is the kind of fuel that bunker fuel is a very dangerous substance when it gets out onto the waterways. The other thing we learned about those ships is that they're the largest moving things that man's ever made. And many of them, not all of them, many of them are so large they can't fit through the Panama Canal or Suez Canal, so they're called Cape-class ships. And they're truly gargantuan in size. They're large, like I say, they're the largest things people have ever built that move. And they have a very poor safety record, an extremely poor safety record in terms of navigability, their size. They also run on diesel and crank out huge amounts of diesel particulate matter while either at port or coming and going. Suffice to say, the whole concept of bringing 48 million tons of coal from the middle of Montana to our shores and then shipping it to China seemed somewhat crazy to us. Some of our group actually looked at the economics of that and discovered that they're basically buying coal from the public at between 80 cents and maybe $15 a ton, and selling in China for $110 to $115 a ton. So we're basically subsidizing the coal industry very substantially through becoming basically a natural resource colony of China. The next slide, you can see the route of this train originating mostly in Colorado, but also in Montana, and coming all the way across a big chunk of Montana, across the panhandle of Idaho, and across almost all of Washington. And in doing so, it goes up to Spokane and then down the Columbia River and then up along the coast, really through every major urban center in western Washington, through Seattle, all the towns, and the large towns in Washington, are hit by this train coming through. One of the recent studies that's just come to our attention is a study done in Spokane, and what it looked at was the risk of cancer living near a coal switching yard, and what they found was about a 20% increase in the cancer rate, a significantly increased cancer rate for those living closest to the rail yard. That risk goes down. And so one of the things we became aware of is the risk is not evenly distributed, just like the pollution is not evenly distributed. In our community, like in the Spokane community, most of the heavy impacts will be in those that live nearest to the rail yard or to the rail line. And since it does bisect all the major cities in Western Washington, again, that just increased our level of concern. Again, if you have the slides, you can see the next picture. We have really big ferries in Washington State. We have a lot of islands and a very, very robust ferry system. And the ferries that we're used to seeing, we think of as huge. They're several stories high. They're very, very large ships. The next slide has a picture of what these Cape-class both transport ships look like compared to one of our ferries. And they look like a matchstick. If you haven't seen that slide, it's worth looking at just to get some idea of the actual proportion of the size of these ships. So what are the core health issues? What do we care about? First off, there's air pollutants. Both coal dust and diesel exhaust. I'll talk both about both those in more detail. The next thing is actually the increased train traffic itself, which leads to noise pollution. Again, before any of us learned about this, we actually heard the coal trains. From where many people live in our community, you can hear them because of the great weight. They actually squeal when they go around the corner. The metal wheels on the metal tracks make a much, much louder noise. The other thing that we're concerned about with the increase in traffic, which would, for our community, be almost one coal train an hour. There would be 12 going north and 12 empty trains coming south at full build-out. And you can hear these, and not only can you hear them from the squeal of the metal tires on the metal tracks, but they have to sound their horn when crossing intersections. So for many people, even now, they're being woken up at 3 a.m. every day, and the prospect of being woken up every hour is an unsettling one personally. But as we look at the noise pollution issue, which I thought very little of initially, it's a very large and substantial health issue when people are awakened that much. It interferes with their lives very substantially. And delays in rail crossings, we've already had one incident where the patient was able to get to the hospital on time for a cardiac surgery. The surgeon was actually able to get on time, but the person that ran the machines that keep the person alive while they're in surgery couldn't get there. And there was almost a 15-minute delay. Again, with a train coming through every hour, 24 hours a day, we expect that to become a much more substantial problem. The other thing that isn't on here in a direct way is that in Western Washington, there were actually 5 deaths where trains hit people this last summer. So again, and that was with a much lower amount of train traffic. So those are the core issues. It's really the impacts of coal dust, the impacts of diesel exhaust, the noise pollution, and the safety issues around rail crossings. Parenthetically, there's a federal law which we discovered that requires that the coal company or the train company can only pay for 10% of any act-rate improvements that are made as a train comes through town. One overpass in the city of Bellingham to bring it up to grade and to utilize it, and this is replacing an existing one, which would be required, is $60 million. Again, 90% of that, by federal law, is required to be borne by the community and not by the proponent of the project. So there are substantial economic impacts. Another economic impact that came to light was that the $700 million for high-speed rail that came to Washington State this last year to what we thought would be improve our rail for commuters. Most of that money is being spent to do rail upgrades for the coal exports and not for what you would think high-speed rail money would be spent for. To get crisply to the medical issues, coal dust is associated with chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and pulmonary fibrosis. Now, all those are primarily in people that are employed in the coal industry and work intimately with coal on a regular basis. There are a number of studies that suggest there are broader impacts in the population. There's there's a review that was done of the articles on that in Australia that I reviewed recently, and there's some more recent articles, all of which suggest there are health impacts to those people who live near these coal facilities. In terms of environmental contamination, that's another major issue with respect to coal dust. According to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, their actual website itself, they say that each of these rail cars, each car on what may be 120 car train, loses about 500 pounds of coal dust between when it leaves Wyoming and when it would get here. Most of that is left in some big problem when these trains initially leave. A lot of it blows off then. People suggest covering them. Apparently they've tried that, and what happens because of the kind of coal this is, it shakes in the rail cars and they actually catch on fire. So covering them is not an issue. They have shaping. They make them more aerodynamic, I guess. That helps, but not much. And they're experimenting with other ways of managing this problem. However, that coal dust, whether it blows off the train or blows off the pile, this has mercury, lead, cadmium, and a number of other heavy metal contaminants, which eventually can get in the water supply, the consequences of which are not yet well studied. One of the other things that we found is one of the impacts for us will be that coal dust will blow off, get in the ocean, settle to the bottom, and cover the biological organisms that are there so that sunlight can reach them, simply a mechanical barrier. So not only will the ships cast a shadow, some of the docks cast a shadow and kill the eelgrass underneath, but this fine layer of coal dust will prevent light from getting down into the plants, thereby making the plants not grow, thereby making the herring not produce, thereby impacting the salmon, thereby impacting even the orchids. So there's a variety of impacts of coal dust at many levels. Mercury is one of the substances that's actually in coal. It's released when it's burnt. Between 15 and 30% of the deposition of mercury that comes to Washington State and the community we live in comes actually from coal-fired power plants in China already. There is a new coal-fired power plant built in China about every week. This is a substantial source of mercury pollution. Mercury is a big deal. It delays learning, shortens attention span, interferes with motor coordination, and basically impacts intelligence. Already there are studies of like Native American people here who eat a fair amount of fish. About 17% of women of childbearing age that are Native American have elevated lead levels, mercury levels, that will impact the intelligence and coordination of their children. And our main water supply for Bellingham already has a ban on the fish, some of the fish that are harvested there, and women of childbearing age and children should not eat them because of the mercury inside of there. Probably the biggest single health issue is actually diesel particulate matter, and these particulate matter is 2.5 micron size. Now the unique thing about that is 2.5 microns. It's all the way in the most distant region of your lung, all the way down to the alveoli. Bigger ones are filtered out in the upper airways, but diesel exhaust basically, when it's combusted, creates a carbon core, which is like a sponge, and all the toxins that are created actually adhere to that, and then they're taken all the way down in the deepest parts of your lung and affect many, many health issues. Again, there's a diagram of that in the slides. What we know about this fine particulate, this 2.5 micron dust particles that are created by, dust is really the right word, it's really a toxic pollutant that's created, that exposure that increases cardiovascular disease, it increases lung disease, it increases hospitalizations for children with asthma, and it impairs the lung development of children. I actually called the one of the places where there's a large terminal now, I called the jurisdictional health officer, and he said that they have double the asthma rates of adjacent jurisdictions. And that's not uncommon. That's what the literature would generally suggest. So increased heart disease, that means strokes, heart attacks, increased lung cancer, increased hospitalizations for asthma, and a very dramatic increase in asthma occurrence itself. These have been pointed out by the American Lung Association, these are reviewed in the American Heart Association for again, systematic review of literature. And again, here in the slides, there are references to several articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, sort of the most prestigious medical journal in the world, that details some of these impacts and effects. In terms of what the impact is already, prior to this increase, and this will be a very substantial increase, a study in 2010 of our region showed that diesel emissions remain the largest contributor to potential cancer risk in our region. In terms of the actual impact of the current level of diesel particulate matter, these 2.5 microns size particles that are created from diesel combustion, we have an estimate in one of the slides of the number of 1,500 additional heart attacks, 450 additional non-heart attack heart disease cases, almost 2,000 cases of acute bronchitis, 100 cases of chronic lung disease, 250 incidents of pneumonia, and 400 emergency visits for asthma, and thousands of incidents of worsening asthma. That's baseline before we can add this dramatic increase, this hourly for diesel engines and these huge ships that would be in our community. It's already estimated, again, at baseline that these particulate matter is already there, generates $190 million each year in additional healthcare costs. So there are dramatic impacts from these things. The community here was impressed initially there would be as much as $10 million in additional tax revenue. When you look at $190 million already of baseline healthcare costs from these particulate matter and related pollutants, that pales by comparison. We already have had one death in our community several years ago, where about 2 years ago, I think, where a young mother was crossing the train tracks on her bicycle and was struck by the train and killed. It's a very real issue for us, and one that we are not excited to have played out again and again. Noise exposure, as I said, is one of the things that I thought the least of initially, but that those loud noises all night long, once every hour, will have a substantial impact. There's actually evidence that increased cardiovascular disease, severe blood pressure, arrhythmias, stroke, ischemic heart disease, cognitive impairment, particularly in children, sleep disturbance leads to fatigue, high blood pressure, and other impacts, increased risk of injuries and accidents, and exacerbation of all mental disorders such as depression and anxiety. Those are a very substantial burden of disease that are documented from chronic noise exposures. Delayed emergency response and increased accidents are both things I've already mentioned. The effects of air pollution, these aren't hypothetical, these are real risks. Those people that already have lung disease, like asthma and emphysema and chronic bronchitis, will be made significantly worse. It will impact elders and children more disproportionately over others. Those with heart disease will be disproportionately impacted, and those with diabetes will be disproportionately impacted, and of course, the workers who are exposed to this directly. These are not hypothetical, these aren't theoretical, these are real known risks. What we don't know is how many of people are going to be impacted in what populations and exactly where. And that's what a health impact assessment would do. Take these national articles, these details that we know happen, and would actually apply them epidemiologically to our community and say how many people would get heart disease, how many people, how bad would the accident be for how many people, and which people, what age groups, and in what locations. And that's really valuable information as you begin to move towards assessing issues. It's one thing to say we may have 230 new jobs, long-term, high-paying jobs. It's another to say that a dozen or 2 dozen or 100 people are going to die from this. That's the way and measure we need to do, not just look at the benefits, but look at real objective assessments of the downside. So what we're calling for is a health impact assessment. We believe that a full assessment of human risks are very important. There's a massive difference for our community. And we're calling for a comprehensive health impact assessment. You can look at all the things that we produced. We make them very public and very available. ColdCreamFacts.org is a site that has all of our information on it. It's got a list of articles. It's got the annotations of those articles. You're free to look at those at any time yourself and assess if you agree that they're pretty substantial or not. One of the things socially that's happened for us is that, interestingly, we've had more and more docs join us, and even more interestingly, not a single physician has withdrawn their support. And every time we do something publicly, we send an email out to every single doctor participating and say, are you still with us? Do you still support that? Not one has withdrawn their support for our call for health impact assessment. I also included some information available on the website about what health impact assessments are, how they're done, that you might find useful. There's also a picture in that additional set of information on diesel particulate matter and how it's constructed, that the core, the elemental carbon core, the organic compounds that surround that, the secondary sulfides and nitrates and metals and the toxins, so you can see the structure of a diesel particulate matter. Well, I think I've gone to my time, and I'll take a break and wait for questions later on.
Frank, would you like to, I think we could give you about 5 more minutes if you'd like to do anything more with the health impact assessment. You had another document.
I'd be happy
to. Okay, go ahead and take another 5 minutes. That would be fine. And you are breaking up a little bit. I don't know.
Sorry. I am on a cell phone. I'll hold it closer to my mouth. Sometimes I talk fast. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
There's actually a tremendous amount to say about this, so I'm just trying to hurry through it as best I can. Typically, there's an hour-long talk, and I'm trying to get it down to 25 minutes. Health impact assessments are a fairly new tool. They've been used a number of times, a couple hundred times in the United States so far. We recently had one done on a new bridge being constructed in Seattle. There are about 80 that are being funded right now that are ongoing in the United States. There's a new one in Seattle on the cleanup of the Duwamish River. But health impact assessments are really, they're ways to look objectively at the impacts on a population of people of any activity, not just this type of activity. And sometimes they do it for construction of a new building. We've been tearing an old building down, building a new highway. So what it intends to do is to objectively look at the health risks that are reasonably attributable to that project in a systematic way that allows for everybody, all the stakeholders to have input, but to be objectively and fairly done. What they predict are the effects of alternative courses of action, even in that population, doing the project, not doing it, not unlike the EIS process, but with a much greater focus on the health consequence itself and a much more objective methodology for doing it. There are more slides that explain some of the details, but in a nutshell, health impact assessments are not required in an EIS unless the agencies that are carrying out that EIS choose to do that. For us, we have county, state, and federal involvement. The Army Corps of Engineers at the federal level, the State Department of Ecology, and the county health, the county are the planning, are the primary agencies. In our case, I believe they're actually going to require that an HIA be done as part of the process, and that's one way to do it. Another way is to actually do an independent separate HIA, but get it done in time for that window between the draft EIS and the final EIS so that you can then introduce it as evidence to be then included and evaluated and assessed and responded to in the overall EIS process. The difference is that you have to come up with the money to do it yourself if you do it independently. There's several contracting companies that are very experienced in doing that, one in San Francisco, one in Oregon. There are also individual universities that have developed a considerable expertise in this activity. So that it can be done in 2 different ways. How well it sticks legally, should it not be followed, or should it be contentious and they ultimately develop a legal battle? Probably better to have it done as part of the EIS in that case. But then there's a very prescribed timeline for those EISs, and you need to fit it into that. And often the people who contract to do the EIS don't have the expertise in the areas of health that would be required. So there are trade-offs in terms of who pays for it. There are trade-offs in terms of how much legal stick there is to it in terms of whether you include it as part of the EIS process or do it independently and then include it in the EIS as part of the testimony during the hearings on the draft environmental impact statement. Those are some of the issues that we've identified that are key issues as people move forward. I'll probably stop there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Frank. And yeah, we will have time for discussion later, so we can return to questions about that. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce Denny Larson. Denny is Executive Director of Global Community Monitor, an organization that trains and supports communities in the use of environmental monitoring tools to understand the impact of fossil fuel industry pollution on their health and the environment. Denny has 23 years of experience as a community organizer and campaigner working with industrial communities fighting for justice. He has assisted communities across the United States and in Southern Africa, India, Thailand, Mexico, and Australia to establish their own monitoring networks. Denny has published a series of community organizing handbooks and co-authored a variety of environmental health legislation and regulation at the local, regional, state, national, and international levels. He has negotiated 24 binding agreements with major polluters in conjunction with impacted communities to reduce tons of unnecessary pollution and create direct community oversight. Denny traveled to Seward, Alaska in March of 2012, just last month, to help set up a citizen air quality monitoring project. Welcome, Denny.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who's taking some time to join us. We want to talk a little bit about the work in Seward, but I also just want to talk a little bit more about how we do our work here at the Global Community Monitor. It's an empowerment-based project where we're training neighborhood organizations or community-based groups, organizations who are focused on largely air pollution problems, but sometimes water and soil, who are impacted by this and are seeking to do their own monitoring of their own environment, sort of to take that back so that they can document more fully the toxic impacts that they're experiencing. So our foundation of our work is evidence-based and community-driven environmental monitoring. The cornerstone of the work is our low-cost sampling buckets, or bucket brigades they've been called. We basically take the technology that's used by agencies and industries and try to simplify it and make it as cost-effective as possible for community-based monitoring. We're having the community members trained to actually take their own air samples and develop a toxic fingerprint that can be linked to specific polluting facilities and even certain operations within the facilities. Try to train people to turn their observations and what is often referred to as anecdotal evidence into hard scientific evidence. The second part of our strategy is really focusing on helping communities link this scientific data to the health trends in the community through simple log sheets that track symptoms that are associated with the exposures and record those and link those together. The project in Seward is our first actual coal dust monitoring project that we've done here in the United States, although we've worked with our partners in India on a similar project. Basically in Seward, and I think this is an important point to bring out, the local organization there, the Resurrection Bay Conservation Group, was very and has been very concerned about the operation in Seward in which coal trains come down from the coal mine. They offload the coal in uncovered large piles, and the coal sits there and blows around. It's moved off of the trains, of course, which creates coal dust. It blows around, on the piles. It's very windy there in Seward. They often get 40, 50, 60-mile-an-hour winds. Then the coal is loaded on ships through a long conveyor belt, I think that's nearly a mile long, which is poorly contained, and coal dust leaks to the ground and the air through its transport along that conveyor system. And it also leaks into the air as it is loaded into the ship, and observations and photographs have shown that actually the coal dust is still spewing out of the ship as it leaves the port of Seward. So the folks there were very interested in documenting coal dust exposures and identifying that, because there's also other, of course, sources of dust in the area, glacial silt, unpaved roads. There's always other sources of dust, and there's been difficulty in trying to, identify exactly how much of the coal dust are people exposed to and how much of it is, not coal dust. What happened there as a result of the activism and people's concern about the coal dust is something that happens very commonly in a situation like this, is the state agency decided to respond by establishing an air monitoring program, which on its face sounds great. But air monitoring, as it's done by agencies or as it's done, in a standard way now, particularly by the agencies driven by the regulatory process, is not very well understood by the public or even, academics, et cetera. But it's basically driven around the mandates that are in the Clean Air Act that require areas to meet certain standards for the concentration of particulate matter as well as ozone, and a very limited number of toxics, which form smog or ozone. And to do this monitoring, the protocols call for you to establish the monitors in locations that represent a large geographic area. So by definition, the monitors, according to these specifications, would not be placed anywhere near a facility like the coal loading operation in Seward, because that would skew the results to be higher than people who are living 10, 15, 20 miles away. So the establishment of an air monitoring program by a state or federal agency in response to these types of problems tends to be actually a fairly dishonest operation on their part, if I can be blunt. It also, in addition, so what they're doing in Seward is the state of Alaska is monitoring for the concentration of PM10. And as you can remember from the doctor's presentation, one of the major concerns is the concentration of the PM2.5, the smaller or more hazardous type of air pollution. So they're kind of missing the boat on that right there. But in addition, they're not looking at what the content of that dust is. So they will be gathering, samples on a random basis every 6 days on a rotating basis for 24 hours, and just getting the PM10 concentration. What we're doing with our testing there in Seward with the folks is that we are going to be gathering samples of PM10, but also PM2.5 for the concentrations, but we're going to be subjecting that dust to analysis for the heavy metals that Dr. Frank has mentioned earlier, and actually a bank of 40 plus heavy metals that's done through X-ray refractory technology at the lab. So this is really important, because if you're just measuring dust, and not speciating out what those particles are made of, you're not actually answering the question or addressing the concern that's been brought in Seward about how much is coal dust contributing to it and what should be done about it. The group there is campaigning for state-of-the-art controls on the existing facility there. We can't answer that question through what the state of Alaska was doing. In fact, people are very confused in Alaska and Seward because they think, because it would be common sense, that if the state was setting up an air monitoring program and the complaints have been, nearly 100% about dust problems in Seward, about the coal facility, that they would have designed their testing to address that. But actually they have designed their system to fail and answer that question and confuse the public that, they're actually doing that. So that's why, one of the reasons why folks up there and ACAT and others were, Cook Inlet Keeper, were very interested in having a real air testing and study done in Seward so that we can answer that question. It really can't be answered by what the citizens are doing. I'm sorry, by what the state is doing. We also actually are working on a proposal with a number of groups in Whatcom County and throughout the Northwest and the West on a proposal to monitor the existing coal dust and diesel problems that are being experienced by the current level of coal export. We're hoping to measure that in 4 different locations along the route from the Powder River Basin, as well as towns where the trains pass through currently, to see what the level of coal dust and diesel is right now that people are experiencing, because we don't have a good read on that due to the fact that, of course, the states and the federal agencies are not doing that type of monitoring in these pollution hotspots. In addition, if and when, and we hope it doesn't happen, those coal export facilities are expanded or built, if we don't have that data, we won't have a baseline on what the problem was before they went in, and we won't be able to tell, how much worse it got. And that's a very important thing to do. That is another part of the types of project that we do, is helping people in advance of large projects going through do that baseline testing so that they have the evidence about, what the levels were of diesel, heavy metals, particulate concentrations prior to these operations starting. That turns out to be extremely important, because if it's done after the fact, you lose the opportunity for the baseline, and of course the amount of diesel and PM and metals that are in the air will be blamed on existing sources and not the or pre-existing sources, and not things like the coal export expansion. So basically, yeah, just to wrap up, to do our work, basically what we do and what we're doing in Resurrection Bay is we're going to be doing a series of trainings. We did the initial training in March, where we trained people on the operation of the monitors, following the standard protocols used by EPA and everybody else to gather the data and handle the samples, chain of custody, field log sheets to ship things to the lab. We'll be going back in a few months after we've gathered a number of the sample data to go through the sample data with the citizens there to talk about what are the results we're getting so far, do any tweaking that we need to do perhaps to the testing protocols and whatnot. And then we'll do a final training once all of the sample data has been gathered in preparation for the release of a final report about what the findings are. Of course, along the way, as significant data comes forward, we will be releasing that to the public and the media, because we feel that people have a right to know, what's going on and what's in their air throughout the process, instead of having to wait a full year like most of the agency protocols call for before communicating data to the public. I can tell you that in initial sampling, we found that there's a large amount of silica in the coal dust there in Seward. We are looking at further testing to delineate the amount of crystalline silica, which is extremely hazardous to breathe, to determine that, as well as the amount of metals that are coming up in the coal dust that we're finding. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at there so we have more time for discussion and questions.
Thank you so much, Denny. I'd like to thank both of our presenters for taking the time to be with us today, and all of you for joining us. And now we would like to open the lines for questions and comments, so please wait a moment while we unmute the lines. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *6 on your telephone to unmute your line, and please state your name and where you're from or what group you're with. We also ask that you please be brief with your comments to allow others the opportunity to speak as well.
Hi, this is Jessica Winstaffer with Chickaloon Village Traditional Council. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jessica.
Hi. I have a question for Dr. James. The 3 proposed coal mines in the Matanuska Valley of south central Alaska are located adjacent to and surrounding residential communities. And additionally, the potential transportation routes for the coal, the Matanuska coal, pass through dense residential communities, including Palmer, Wasilla, and Anchorage. Considering Washington's coal railroads go past many residents, what actions do the Whatcom docs recommend for the residents that live near the coal trains?
Well, I think the first thing is to be informed. I mean, the most important thing, like I said, none of us cared about this until we began to look into it. So the first thing is, I think, you just get core information. Once you do that, I think there are going to be some concerns that are raised. I think the same issues that are issues here are issues that I think other people are going to be concerned about. Different communities have different values, but basically there's a substantial risk of increasing things like heart attacks, asthma, strokes. And then the question is just how big is that impact going to be on your community? The only way to determine that is to do something like a health impact assessment, to actually take the data that should be calculatable about how much is going to be created from the dust, from the coal dust, and from the diesel particulate matter, and then apply that to a model that predicts how many additional cases of asthma or heart attacks are going to be in that community. Then that community will be in place to make a decision. Maybe it'll be a big impact, maybe it won't. But to not do that means that you're just gambling. And as you know, there's lots and lots and lots of examples of where that hasn't worked that well. You certainly can't trust the industry to do it for you. I think the example of the lies and the dispute that went on down in the Gulf that have come to pass just in the last few days are very dramatic examples of where you can't trust the industry itself radio.
Thank you, Dr. James. Is there someone else who would like to?
Yes, this is Regna Merritt from Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I have a question for Denny. I wonder if any of the 4 locations that you are monitoring now are in Washington or along the Columbia.
Just to clarify, where we are right now is proposal stage. So I've drafted a proposal for a number of the organizations working on this. That's being reviewed, and hopefully, as always, we need to find the funding to do it. But there is those groups are in the process of also trying to establish the criteria for choosing those sites so that we can try to get the best representation of the diversity of communities that are being impacted by the trains now. So, yeah, we're still in the beating the bushes to raise money and talking about it stage. But if you're interested in being involved in that would be great. You can just shoot me an email, and I will keep you in the loop on that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. And Dr. James, you were breaking up a little bit about the last question as well. I'm wondering, is it possible for you to call back in on a landline?
I'd like to say that I own a landline, but I don't.
Okay, so if you could just be aware that it's
I'll
real
speak
clear.
up as best I can.
Okay,
Sorry.
Thank you so much. All right, if there's another question or comment.
James Wells, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is probably mostly for Denny. You talked about sort of spatial distribution. My question is about time distribution. A long time ago I did air quality modeling relating to permitting of volatile toxics, and a big part of it was choosing the sort of worst 5 days of the year based on metadata. Do your efforts involve trying to identify the conditions most likely to create problematic conditions and making sure and capture readings at that time?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, basically where we start is we start with, debriefing and incorporating the local knowledge about the expertise among the people who, volunteered to be part of the monitoring team. So getting that information together, like, yeah, it's really bad on these super windy and clear days, that type of thing, so that we can start to sketch out what we're targeting. And then actually the way we do the monitoring right now for this particular project, but usually for any project where we have a specific, physical source that we're trying to monitor, is that we will be looking at the predicted meteorologic conditions for the following 24 hours where we're thinking about sampling to see if, the wind, where to place the monitors, so because we want to be downwind as directly as possible for as long as possible during the 24 hours, looking for those sort of, I would say from what I learned up there, the drier, windier conditions that seem to lead to the worst dusting that people get from the coal dust, and try to, see if those match and if we can get downwind on those days. So I think we're using a form of what you're doing without actually having the expertise or the luxury of actually being able to model that out, but just using the local experience. And then also as we go through that, looking at the data as it comes back in and testing our theories that these, for example, dry, very windy days are leading to more coal dust than others, and to see if the samples come back and reflect that. And if not, then go back and tweak how we're doing the testing.
Perhaps a medical follow-up for Frank would be, how much do short-term spikes matter? If you catch it at just the wrong moment and for 5 minutes it's a very high concentration, is it still something that medically you average out over 8 hours, or do those 5 minutes disproportionately matter?
Well, that's one thing the data is pretty clear about already, is that 5 minutes actually matters. I mean, the impacts can go on far beyond that acute exposure, so that there are several examples in the medical literature where there are these high spikes, and they actually have significant impacts just from those sort of short exposures. So I think the short exposures are extremely important to document, and when you put that into your modeling, you have to consider the known impacts of those short exposures on the endothelium, the lining of your blood vessels, which is one of the things that cause acute heart attacks. For example, that would be an example of where acute heart attacks could be a result of that acute spike more than just chronic low level or even no level.
Thank you.
Great.
And again,
Thanks very much.
To unmute your line, press *6 if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment.
This is Lisa Arkin from Beyond Toxics, located in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, where they plan to ship coal through Eugene to the Port of Coos Bay. And then my question is, the Port of Coos Bay has been claiming that they will cover the coal cars to mitigate dust and to essentially dismiss complaints about exposure to coal dust. Have you heard of this technique being used, and how would you answer that kind of claim with facts about health?
And that's a call.
From a medical point of view,
okay.
From a medical point of view, I can just tell you that I think more likely than covering, they're actually experimenting with some sprays, adhesive sprays, kind of like Elmer's glue that they spray on top to keep it in. I think that's a much more likely outcome than actually covering them, depending on which type of coal it is. All coals are not equal in that respect. I think that Powder River Basin coal is more likely to actually combust. They have problems with that even in storage areas. That's why they have the big water cannons out there to cool them off. So I think covering may be an option for some types of coal. My understanding, however, is that it may be more likely that they'll have some sort of spray adhesive that they put on them as a partial solution to the problem. Jenny may know a lot more about that than me, though.
Well, let's just say that I've had a lot of experience with sort of and I think many of the people on the call and even the questioner probably has, with the end of the pipe, what I call the end of the pipe strategy, or the we'll cover it up strategy. It don't work. And I have zero confidence in the quote-unquote surfactants being able to control the dust. I think Frank is right. I don't think they're going to go to the expense of covering it. But during this period where they're trying to get approval of these projects, they can and will say anything. And I think the experience of what happened up in Longview and the number of less than truthful statements that were revealed there show clearly that you're going to be lied to repeatedly, and you're going to be offered pie in the sky about how they're going to deal with this. And I think there's a couple of other important things. One is that, again, the rail cars, number one, that doesn't address diesel, just covering them up or putting surfactant on it. Number two, the surfactant is likely to be highly toxic itself. Number three, there's more than just the coal cars. There is, you have to look at and continually remind people about the life cycle. And glad the folks from Chickaluna are on the call. There is the mine. There is the storage of the loading of the coal at the mine. There is the transport along the route on the rail cars. There is the unloading of the rail cars. There's the storage of the coal. There is the loading of the coal on the ship. And then, of course, don't forget that coal burned in China. I think I heard from Heidi, one of the scientists at ACAT, burned in China in the east. That mercury and other heavy metals will travel back to the west coast of the United States, and you will breathe it in about 6 or 7 days, and it will start exposing the fish, the wildlife, and the environment here. So it don't go away just because it goes to China. So I think all of those are important things to remember when these guys come in with their sort of one-off thing like, well, we'll put spray on it, or we'll cover it up, or this or that. To keep going back to the whole life cycle of what's going on here and how bankrupt the whole concept is from cradle to grave.
It's one of the things that I found in talking to people, this is Dr. James, that actually live next to the existing ones, is that the promises are never what the reality is. Is that they put in a lot of technology to try to control coal dust. Very, very ineffective in most of the cases that I've talked to the people that actually live with the installation now. I know that the port just north of us basically has about a 5-mile ring around it where coal dust deposition is clearly evidenced 5 miles in a large circle, depending on the wind, which way the wind's blowing, but about 5 miles away. And it's always that way. I mean, despite their attempts to contain it. I'm sure that they will make attempts to contain it. All those attempts are technological things. All of them are run by people. All of them will fail at times. And what you need to understand is what the failures are likely to be and who's going to hold those people accountable when those failures occur, if they do.
I've got a risk analysis question.
Can you state your name, please?
Yeah, this is Carl Wassley, Alaska's Big Village Network. Up here in Alaska, we have lots of villages, and what I've seen regarding risk analysis and communications on risk with the pollution and discharges in both water, air, and on the land is the current process of statistical variations just excludes all small villages because the population is not large enough. What would you recommend when we're dealing with these large corporations and the failure of the state and other health institutions that are supposed to be doing risk analysis and looking at I guess that statistical variation of not having enough people to determine a hot spot. That's just something I wanted to throw out there. Run into that quite often.
This is Dr. James, and actually that's a huge problem for Native Americans and Alaska Natives, in that they typically, in many large studies, just get rounded out of existence. At 2 or 3% of the population, they typically don't even show up in most large studies. The advantage of a health impact assessment is that they ought to be focusing on those subpopulations because they're already adversely impacted very dramatically by many other factors. And the addition of this to other things like the diabetes rate or the other underlying disease has to be accounted for. And you can't round them out of existence. A health impact assessment looks specifically at those subpopulations. An environmental impact assessment won't. That's why I think we need very much to incorporate health impact assessments into this process as a way to protect those particular populations. So Native people are disproportionately impacted, so are elders, so are kids. All those people typically are marginalized in the usual political process, and we need to find ways to give them voice and give them give the impacts on their health equal standing with the impacts on all the other people who will be impacted.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. James. I think that's a good place to end. We are out of time. So I just want to say before closing today, I'd like to remind everyone that our teleconference seminars are archived and available for download on our website at www.akaction.org. And this call will be available in a day or two, hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. I just want to, again, thank all of you who called in, and especially our guests, Dr. Frank James and Denny Larson, for your time, for sharing your expertise, and for answering all those questions. And also, I'd like to remind you that there are just abundant resources on our website for this call. You can find out about winter wind speeds in Seward, Alaska. There's a lot of health impact information. So please explore those resources. And if you have further questions about this topic, you can give a call to the ACAT's office at 907-222-7714. You can also contact Heidi by email at heidi@akaction.org. So thank you again, everyone.